Okay, let's just dive right into this. I want you to picture the intense, hyper-focused environment of a trauma bay. You know the scene. The monitors are alarming, the room's moving incredibly fast, and the margin for error is, well, it's absolutely zero. In these high-stakes physiological emergencies, you really cannot rely on gut feelings or just treat the superficial symptoms. Survival depends entirely on granular, exact physiological decision boundaries. So welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tearing down the complex decision forks where just a few subtle variables completely shift your management of a crashing patient. So let's start by posing the ultimate clinical dilemma. You've got a trauma patient, and they are profoundly hypotensive. You've done the standard moves. You've rapidly infused 3 liters of isotonic crystalloid fluid, but their pressure literally hasn't budged. What is your execution boundary right here? Do you just keep pushing fluids, or do you pivot? We absolutely have to isolate this profound hypotension using exact hemodynamic parameters because blind fluid loading in the wrong type of shock, actually, scratch that. It isn't just ineffective, it's downright deadly. So, this explainer is set up as a highly structured tactical briefing. Here is our roadmap. First, shock hydrodynamics. Second, thermal crises. Third, burn physics. And finally, clinical traps.
Let's kick things off with Module 1, Shock Hydrodynamics.
When you look at the raw hemodynamic data, the numbers completely diverge based on the specific etiology of the shock. In both hypovolemic and cardiogenic shock, cardiac output drops and systemic vascular resistance spikes up. But the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, or PCWP, is what separates them. You see, the tank is empty in hypovolemia, so the PCWP is low, but the pump is failed in cardiogenic shock, so the PCWP is high. Now, distributive shock, like early sepsis, is kind of the wild card here. You get a hyperdynamic cardiac output, but with bottomed-out vascular resistance. Crucially, you want to isolate profound hypotension using mixed venous oxygen saturation, or SVO2. A low SVO2 means tissues are starving and extracting max oxygen, pointing back to hypovolemic or cardiogenic. But a high SVO2, that isolates early distributive shock, because the cells are failing to extract oxygen despite that hyperdynamic output. This perfectly isolates the absolute red line difference where continuous fluid loading crosses over into being dangerous. Think about our trauma patient. If they're hypotensive after 3 liters of fluid but present with an elevated PCWP and high central venous pressure with flat neck veins, you're unmasking an occult cardiogenic shock component. Pushing more volume into a failing pump doesn't help, it literally just floods the lungs. You have to treat the absolute parameters. All right, moving right along to Module 2, Thermal Crises. Shifting gears to environmental emergencies, you'll see that absolute core temperatures dictate very rigid clinical pathways. Severe hypothermia is strictly anything below 28 degrees Celsius, and hyperthermia crosses the red line at greater than 40. In severe hypothermia, that extreme cold drives massive cardiac irritability and dangerous ventricular fibrillation. Because of this, you absolutely must avoid aggressive chest compressions or rough handling unless true cardiac arrest is confirmed, and you confirm that via a full 1-minute pulse check. Now, because of that severe irritability we just talked about, we have to follow the core rewarming mandate for any patient under 28 degrees. This requires strict, active internal rewarming. We're talking warm IV fluids, warmed pleural or peritoneal lavage, and even ECMO to heat the blood directly. And please remember this clinical absolute. You cannot pronounce a patient dead until their body is actively rewarmed to at least 32 degrees Celsius. The saying holds true. They aren't dead until they are warm and dead. And honestly, this brings up a massive clinical trap known as the defibrillation rule. If your severely hypothermic patient goes into ventricular fibrillation, their cold, highly irritable heart will often completely fail to respond to standard electrical countershocks or even aggressive antiarrhythmic drugs. You actually have to force thermal correction above 30 degrees Celsius before the heart's electrical pathways will stabilize enough to even respond to your defibrillator. Jumping to the total opposite extreme, we really need to distinguish heat exhaustion from heat stroke. It's a critical fork. Heat exhaustion lacks neurologic disturbances, but the exact second you see altered mental status or CNS dysfunction alongside hyperthermia, that's heat stroke. The immediate mandate there is rapid evaporative spray cooling or ice water immersion to drop the core temp below 39 degrees rapidly. And here's the kicker: avoid antipyretics. They won't work for environmental hyperthermia, and they'll actually just worsen impending liver toxicity and multi-organ failure. Okay, on to Module 3, Burned Physics.
Severe burns basically cause a total mechanical failure of the skin, which drives massive fluid shifts from the intravascular space directly into the interstitial tissues. It's systemic capillary leak syndrome, resulting in hypovolemic burn shock. To fight this, we execute the Parkland formula. To calculate the total 24-hour lactated Ringer's volume needed, you multiply 4 milliliters by the patient's weight in kilograms by the total percentage of body surface area burned. And remember, that's only for partial and full thickness burns. But look, the math is honestly only half the battle here. Execution requires following a strict timing matrix. You've got to administer the first 50% of that massive fluid volume strictly over the first 8 hours. The clinical trap that catches people, time 0 is the exact time of the injury, not the time of hospital arrival. If a patient gets to 3 hours after an explosion, you only have 5 hours left to compress and deliver that entire first half of the fluids.
And how do we know if we're winning? Well, success isn't guessed. It's tracked strictly via hourly urine output. You're aiming for a really tight window of 0.5 to 1.0 milliliters per kilogram per hour. Hitting that target is how you confirm you're maintaining adequate organ perfusion despite all that capillary leak.
Let's bring it all together in Module 4, Clinical Variants and Traps. Let's rapid fire through some of the most disruptive bedside traps you're going to see. First up, using pure vasopressors and hypovolemic shock before you've achieved adequate volume expansion. Doing that causes severe ischemia because, well, you're just clamping down on empty pipes. Second trap, counting first-degree sunburns in your Parkland calculations. You only count partial and full-thickness burns. Otherwise, you're going to dangerously over-resuscitate the patient. And third, running standard aggressive cardiac drug protocols on an unwarmed severe hypothermia patient. Like we talked about, it simply won't work until they are warmed up. Finally, let's look at the hemodynamic profile of acute decompensated heart failure and cardiogenic shock. Spotting a decreased stroke volume index right alongside an increased pulmonary capillary wedge pressure completely alters your required pathway. You have to immediately shift away from standard fluid resuscitation. Instead, you move toward inotropic support and diuresis. You have to treat the failing pump rather than just blindly treating a low blood pressure reading. So I'm going to leave you with a bit of a provocative question today. When you're standing there in the trauma bay, are you treating the absolute physiological parameters, or are you just reacting to the superficial symptoms? Whether it's mapping shock hydrodynamics with wedge pressures and oxygen saturation, forcing thermal correction before you even try defibrillation, or calculating that strict burn volume matrix from the exact minute of injury, survival relies on exact numbers. Challenge your fundamental assumptions, trust the parameter matrices, and never stop analyzing the raw data. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.